You are listening to an Art Media podcast.
Israelis are still resolute that Hamas can't control the Gaza Strip, but they want the hostages back, and they're starting to understand it's going to be a long, historic viewpoint into the future to make that go, but Hamas isn't the power in the Gaza Strip. This has crossed the Rubicon in the Israeli psyche, that this war is no longer something that is in the best interest. If you can end it, get the hostages back and make sure that there is, at least on the record, a different government in the Gaza Strip.
It's 7:30 a.m. on Sunday, June 29th in New York City. It is 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, June 29th in Israel, as Israelis begin a new week, counting 631 days since the war began, and while 50 hostages still remain in the underground tunnels of Gaza. After a stunning 12-day military campaign in Iran, potentially lifting the greatest existential threat that has been looming over Israel for decades, the focus in Israel is shifting back to Gaza. Earlier this week, 7 Israeli soldiers were killed when an armored vehicle was hit by an explosive device. A few days later, the daily national newspaper Haaretz published a troubling article citing soldiers describing being ordered to deliberately shoot at unarmed Gazans waiting for humanitarian aid. The IDF acknowledged that it was probing the allegations that troops are using deadly fire on Gazans, but denied that they were being ordered by their commanders to do so. The Prime Minister and the Defense Minister issued a statement refuting this report entirely, calling it, quote, a blood libel. The war in Gaza is just over 3 months away from approaching its 2-year anniversary, as IDF soldiers continue to be killed on a weekly basis, and we still have no sense for what the future holds for the Israeli hostages still in Gaza. So Israelis are increasingly asking, perhaps in stark contrast to the sentiment towards the achievements in the Iran war, where are things headed in the war in Gaza? Another reason this question is top of mind is that President Trump seems to be pushing hard for a ceasefire in Gaza. On Saturday, he told reporters in the Oval Office that he believes a ceasefire will be reached within the next week. At the same press conference, he referenced the, quote, terrible situation that's going on in Gaza and spoke about the recent decision by the U.S. to give $30 million to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Joining us to unpack these critical and challenging questions is Call Me Back regular Nadav Ayel, who's also a political analyst at Yediot Achronot. Nadav, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Nadav, I want to get into what's been going on in Gaza and where things are heading, but before we do, I just want to spend a moment on the West Bank. There was a report about an event in the West Bank, and it's been dominating the news in Israel over the last 36 hours, in which, according to the report, several dozen Israeli settlers in the West Bank attacked IDF reserve soldiers. So I'm trying to understand from the U.S. what actually is going on here. It's a little confusing. Could you just tell us a little bit about it before we move on to the other questions?
Yeah, so this story dominated the news during the weekend in Israel. It actually began 24 hours before that in an area called Kafar Malek near Ramallah. It's the center of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. Dozens of settlers arrived. It's actually, I'm saying settlers, but I should say that the settlement movement is saying that these people don't usually reside in Judea and Samaria. So they're coming from within the Green Line in sovereign Israel. But dozens of far-right activists arrived to this Palestinian village. They were burning buildings and cars. They were confronting the residents there. At least 10 Palestinians got hurt because of stones thrown by the Israelis. A military force came there, an IDF force came there, and the IDF force had seen shots fired at them from within the Palestinian village as part of this entire mess. And the IDF force opened fire, and 3 Palestinians were killed in a confrontation that began actually with these far-right activists that were storming the village, and what usually IDF sources, security sources, are simply describing as a pogrom. Okay, this was this was an expression used at the time by the head of the Shin Bet and by others. Then, 24 hours later, in the same area, IDF forces identified dozens of far-right settlers driving in vehicles in an area that's described as a closed military zone. And the reason it's a closed military zone is because there was an illegal outpost that was built there by the settlers. This illegal outpost was built on private Palestinian land. The IDF tried to stop them. Then these Jewish Israeli activists threw stones towards the IDF force. They assaulted both physically the soldiers and the regiment commander, who said they tried to choke him. They destroyed some vehicles, and they and they tried allegedly to actually hit some soldiers with their cars. And this was of course, a huge story. The chief of staff of the IDF, Eyal Zamir, came there, in less than 6 hours to show his support for that regiment commander, who said he was physically assaulted by the far-right activists, settlers, whoever was exactly there. There were a few people arrested. The prime minister issued a condemnation to what happened, as the defense minister
condemning the settlers, or condemning these activists.
Condemning the far-right activists or settlers. The chief of staff said, and I quote, I'm trying to translate as I go along, there's a wonderful settlement movement here that's law-abiding, but these activities by groups of extremists, first of all, hurt the local Israeli population, but also hurts the security in this sector, and it diverts the security forces from their main mission. This violence and this extremist actions, if they will not be treated in a systematic way, can end with a catastrophe. This is Eyal Zamir, the chief of staff of the IDF, speaking a few hours later, while being there and showing his support for that regiment commander, who's really tasked with supplying security in the region, mainly for the Israeli settlers living there, and was attacked by those far-right activists. Now, condemnations from the prime minister to these actions against the IDF soldiers, from the defense minister, from the chief of staff, naturally, but a condemnation from Bezalel Smotrich, to whom? To the IDF.
There you go.
Smotrich was accusing the IDF that they shot live ammo, or suggesting the idea that they shot live ammo against the Israelis. There was a separate incident in that sector in which the IDF got stones thrown at their vehicles. They shot in the air as a response, and one of these, who's a teenager, actually got shot in the same region. They're saying, we don't know that it's us. We didn't know who's throwing stones at us. Now, I'm telling you this story, and I guess that many of the people now listening are saying, what's this mess? What's this all about? And the answer is, welcome to some parts of the West Bank. This is happening all the time. First of all, these kind of raids against Palestinian villages that 2 or 3 years ago would be unheard of are now happening almost every 2 weeks, every week. We're hearing about something like that. And the Israeli Shin Bet, the security service, that's responsible, among other things, for far-right activists. One of the reasons that it is in a direct confrontation with this coalition. But also the IDF are extremely worried, and they're blaming, in off-the-record conversations, the government. They're blaming the police, that's controlled by Ben Gvir, in not doing what they're supposed to do. They're saying that they're getting some sort of a tacit support from the establishment. One example to that is that there's a notion in Israeli law called administrative arrest. It's not a very democratic notion, but basically it says that if someone is a security threat, the government can arrest them without indicting them for a specific period of time if they're an imminent security risk. Okay? And Palestinians are arrested through administrative arrest. Now, in Israel, human rights activists, by the way, from left and right, don't like this tool at all, and everybody can understand why. It's very much an emergency tool that you use. Now, the Shin Bet, Israeli security service, was up in arms against this. Their professional opinion was that you need to use it because the far-right activists across the West Bank or operating in the West Bank are very sophisticated. It takes a real toll on the Shin Bet to actually find enough evidence to indict, and sometimes they just want to get that person out of the West Bank. And the defense minister said, I'm vetoing it. This is not going to happen anymore. And this is one example to sources in the defense apparatus saying this is the way in which Katz is actually giving them some sort of a tacit support. Of course, Katz advisors and people are saying that there is absolutely no connection, and that the Shin Bet only asked one administrative arrest since basically he came into office, and he refused that, but that's it. So they're saying it's a non-story. But this is just an example, Dan. What's happening in the West Bank very much related to how the war in Gaza is. We're focused on Iran, we're focused on other issues. It became, in many areas, I don't want to say a no man's land, but it became a place in which you have armed groups, like far-right groups, roaming there with their cars. They're trying to have a new outpost. The IDF is trying to stop them. The IDF is not doing a good job at that because the IDF is not a police, and it's not the Shin Bet, it's not the security service. So they can arrest them immediately. And by the way, they're Israeli citizens. They're not supposed to be arrested by the IDF. They're supposed to be arrested by the Israeli police in these areas in the West Bank. So they pick up the phone, they call the local police station, and that local police station, saying the IDF, doesn't really want to cooperate with the IDF because the police is very much now, I don't want to say a Ben Gvir kingdom, because it isn't, right? We see there, for instance, the investigations against the prime minister, but there are areas in the police in which some officials won't want to get infused with the conflict of arresting Israeli settlers. So this mess is just one of the things that Israel has been sort of sidelining during the war in Gaza and the war with Iran, but really blew up during this weekend, and we're not going to hear anything about it until, this is Eyal Zamir saying, not me saying, a catastrophe happens. And what does he mean by a catastrophe? I think he means the possibility that IDF soldiers, for instance, will shoot, not knowing who they're shooting at because they're being attacked, or you might have a terror attack against Palestinians, and we have seen terror attacks against Palestinians. That would be devastating, and that's something that the IDF is extremely worried about.
Okay, so speaking of another area where the IDF has been focused, as you said, I want to talk about Gaza. While this potential powder cake here in the West Bank continues to bear monitoring clearly. And so there's a lot happening. It seems like all of a sudden there's a lot happening in Gaza or maybe there was a lot happening, just weren't paying attention because we're all focused on Iran. So I want to just set the table, Nadav, by going back to 3 to 4 months ago, since the last ceasefire ended. If you could describe for us what the IDF has actually accomplished in Gaza over the last 3 or 4 months. What's been happening there?
So the IDF is in the process of an operation called the Chariots of Gideon, which is an operation that was supposed to push Hamas into a deal, basically, okay? Or occupy the Gaza Strip. It has several phases, and right now the IDF has occupied basically about 75%. There was an argument made by this government that previously the IDF, led by the previous officers, by previous chief of staff, didn't hold to the territory that it took in the Gaza Strip, therefore we needed to occupy it again and again. That argument as of itself, I have to say, is just maturely speaking, is downright false. But here's the point. They changed their tactics. They wanted to take a hold of land, hold to that land, clear that land as far as they are concerned, and they thought this would push Hamas into a deal. And if not, there would be a second and third phase in which actually the IDF occupies the center of the city of Gaza. Just to be clear, there are 1 million people living there then. 1 million people in Gaza City. And there are the camps in the central parts of Gaza, places like Deir al-Balah and others. Mm-hmm. And in these camps, and in the city of Gaza, you see really the resistance of Hamas there. Now, Israel could not operate in some areas in Gaza freely because it feared and still fears jeopardizing the lives of the hostages. So the first parts were just pushing through places like Han Yunis, Rafah, other sections, and allowing the local population in Gaza to move south. So Israel didn't cut Gaza, and we spoke about this many times on this podcast. It didn't cut Gaza, east to west. It didn't create the Netzarim corridor again that prevents Palestinians moving from the north to the south. It was trying to push the Palestinian population from north to the south because it wanted to operate, for instance, in Gaza City. Even in the IDF today, they would admit it didn't work. How do we know that? We're a few months later, and Hamas wasn't pushed to a deal as a result of this operation. Mm-hmm. Another thing that Israel did was to support the food distribution centers by the Gaza Humanitarian Effort Organization, the GHF, which is a big deal, and we spoke about this on the podcast too. These are the two elements that were driving the Israeli policy in Gaza. One was military pressure against Hamas, saying we're willing to occupy the entire Gaza Strip if needed, trying to push them to another deal. Mm-hmm. And the second one was taking the way Hamas leverage on the local population through supporting the food distribution center. Now, was it successful? If you speak with Shin Bet officials, with army officials in Abdandan, even in the last 24 hours,
who's the head of Shin Bet now?
Is killing sometimes between
15
to 40 Hamas operatives a day with targeted strikes. I don't mean, they don't maneuver in the vicinity of a neighborhood, identify someone, a figure with a gun or a rifle, then hit them. No, I mean, they have intelligence coming from the Israeli intelligence branch in the army or from the Shin Bet of a specific location, specific person. They know his ID. It goes through a process, then they decide to strike. Mm-hmm. So they're saying, basically, we're killing a lot of terrorists, as far as we are concerned, and we are pushing, and we have reached a point in which we control almost 75% of the territory. On the other hand, what happens, and Dan, you know this well, this idea of taking a hold of a territory and staying there is exactly the idea that leads to the birth of guerrilla warfare. Because you're not on the move, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that you're moving quickly in, quickly out, you take out the terrorists. No, you're staying there with your armored vehicles. You're staying there with your camps. And the enemy learns what you're doing. And therefore now, the main weapon that is used by Hamas is improvised explosive weapons. This is the kind of explosives that was used in the disaster in which 7 Israeli soldiers, one officer, were killed. So that Hamas terrorist, you can see that video, unfortunately, that terrible video in which he basically runs from the rubble. He's holding this ID in his hand, and he throws it into the armored vehicle, and he just runs away, and it blows up. And that armored vehicle burned for hours. They needed to tow it to Israel's territory just to put it down.
Oh my
And
god.
all the soldiers died inside. It was, it was a terrible fire trap. And this is just one story. And this tool is used all across Gaza by Hamas, and they're not having any sort of shooting matches with the IDF anymore. There's no skirmishes in which there's a bunch of Hamas fighters going from a tunnel shooting against an IDF force. This is not how it goes down these days. It's all about these IEDs, which then again you remember from Iraq was the number one issue at a certain point. So now it's the number one issue for the IDF. The IDF officials.
Our use of IEDs, is this, I mean, I get that it's now it's in high usage, but is it a new tool entirely? Like, is this something we hadn't seen in earlier parts of the war being used by Hamas?
It's not a new tool, but it's the tool of choice right now for Hamas, and it's working very well because you have a lot of forces, unfortunately, in the Gaza Strip, so they have routes, and these routes will have, for instance, trucks with just food and ammunition going into the Gaza Strip, and you have these forces that are staying in a routine in specific areas, and you need to, we say in Hebrew, I'm translating, open the routes or make sure that the routes are secured from IEDs. And Hamas is excelling at this. And by the way, what explosives are they using? And the answer is that Israel has dropped so many bombs on the Gaza Strip that there is enough explosives that didn't detonate. And they're actually using IDF explosive to make these IEDs. And that explosive is, extremely efficient. So this is a big challenge. And if you ask the IDF, they made great strides with their operation, and it's working, but the strategic aim has not been reached. And right now, the IDF is very close to coming to the government, and it's going to happen, I guess, in the next week or so, Dan, and saying, look, the goals that you have set to us have been achieved according to the phases. You wanted to take control, you wanted to pressure, you wanted us to secure the food distribution places. We did all that. Now what do you want us to do? And here's what the IDF really wants. They want the war to be over. Now, it does, by saying over, I don't mean they want Hamas to control the Gaza Strip. Or they think that there is very little to be achieved right now unless Israel takes full military control of the Gaza Strip, something that, as far as I know, the IDF is not recommending, or we reach an agreement in which Hamas doesn't control the Gaza Strip and the hostages return back home.
And we're
they
waiting
are
for the next
frustrated,
Hamas to
some
emerge.
people with the chief of staff, by the lack of progress there. And everybody knows, and you see this with the Israeli public. Look at the difference between what has happened with Iran, what has happened with Hezbollah, and what has happened in the Gaza Strip. This doesn't look like a success because it isn't a success. It's not only eating away with the Israeli society with this not so slow stream of casualties, of people who are being killed, but also with international legitimacy. And the parents of the soldiers who were killed in that armored vehicle last week,
Yeah.
they gave just heartbreaking speeches and interviews, talking about their 19-year-old kids. I want to read something that Alexandra Radia, who's the mother of Staff Sergeant Nir Radia, who was killed in the Puma, the armored vehicle attack. She said this on Channel 12 this week. She said about her son, and I'm quoting, he was already exhausted. He said everyone there was tired. He used to call him and his friends blackened. We're all blackened. From the moment he finished the 12th grade, he's been in an endless war. The host from Channel 12 asked if she had a message about the war, and she broke down in tears. And she said this message isn't just from him, it's from his friends who are still out there on the mission. They're tired, they're burned out. This has to end. They're just kids who finished high school. They're struggling in every way. This must stop. Now, you wouldn't hear these kind of statements on television this way, put this way, until I think the last 3 weeks. Something happened. Something happened specifically with this disaster, but I'll tell you what happened. You're starting to hear from the government, from Miki Zohar, who's a minister in the government. You're starting to hear from Likud officials. You're hearing from Moshe Gafni, who's an official in the coalition, an ultra-Orthodox politician. You're hearing off-the-record briefings that the government wants the war to end in Gaza. So something is happening, and that shift, that change, you can see it in the polls. By the way, 3-4 months ago we discussed this, and people wouldn't believe it. See, you're seeing 60% of the Israeli Jewish public saying, end the war, get the hostages, even if this means we don't care what's happening in Gaza right now. Okay, just end the war, get the hostages. End the war, get the hostages. And there's a poll in Israel Hayom saying, you know, that the bigger chunk of Likud voters are saying now the same things. Right?
I have that poll right here.
Yeah.
For the it looks like for the first time, at least in the Israel Hayom polling, a plurality of Likud voters are saying they want an end to the war, like a rapid wind down, and that a smaller percent actually want the war to continue. And these are voters who support this government.
To some extent, people are asking, and it's a very valid question, what exactly is Israel fighting for right now?
Meaning, yeah. What is the actual plan? I mean, I hear this all the time, by the way, from Israelis who say, "Look, I can be on board with continuing the war in Gaza, but please articulate what the plan is. Where is it going?"
Yes.
It's funny because I keep hearing this from Americans, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, because you're hearing this from Israelis. I'm hearing from Americans who are supportive of Israel, and I'm saying, okay, you know, but what exactly are the goals?
Right. I actually just yesterday, an American said to me, I support the war in Gaza. I support what Israel's trying to accomplish, but help me explain what the actual plan is. So I want to get to this, what you talked about last week on our podcast, which is about this possible Tehran for Gaza deal between President Trump and Netanyahu. The idea being that, yes, the U.S. getting involved in Iran and conducting that extraordinary operation 1 week ago was in the U.S. interest to do, but it was also very important to Israel, and that the Trump administration basically said, we really want the war in Gaza to wind down, you know, engage in this massive intervention in Iran, but we want to wrap up Gaza. And so there's something around that idea or that concept that is driving negotiations right now. So I don't know if there's actual negotiations. Tell us what's going on with regard to a possible ceasefire.
So, first of all, President Trump in the last 24 hours has said that he wants to have a ceasefire and get the hostages back home. And the messaging coming from Washington is really loud and clear. They want the war to end. The president has said so, on the record several times. But it sees that whether or not there was a formal deal of Gaza for Tehran, or it's, we green lighted this for you, now you do something for us, whether it's this or that, it's very much in the process of actually advancing. We know that the White House officials have been speaking with families of hostages. In the last 2 weeks, I've been speaking with these families. They've been very optimistic as to the chances of ending the war. And by ending the war, I don't mean only the two-phase deal that Steve Witkoff had, first the release of 8 hostages, then the rest, but really ending the war in a way that really gives clarity as to who's going to control the Gaza Strip in the day after. Here's where we are at right now. The negotiations are ongoing. Qatar is mediating in these negotiations. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, it's the same question that we have had over a year now. And that is, who's going to control the Gaza Strip in the day after? And will Hamas have leverage and power in that new Gaza Strip? And what the Israelis tried to do during the war is to make sure that if the war stops, Hamas disarms, and that it leaves the Gaza Strip, its leadership leaves the Gaza Strip through exile. And it's very clear right now that disarming is not really going to happen from 2 reasons. First of all, Hamas isn't going to agree to that in the way that we think about disarmament. And secondly, even if they will agree, Dan, no one will be able to verify. You remember trust but verify, right? So there's no way that you can verify this unless you take a hold of the entire Gaza Strip. So let's say Hamas says, yeah, you know what? We're going to disarm. We're going to give you, like the Egyptians are saying,
right.
every last Kalashnikov left. This is the Egyptian demand for this. Let's say they do that. If Israel doesn't have the military rule in the Gaza city, in the camps of central Gaza, if it doesn't go house to house, there is no way that you could verify that they actually disarmed. So what is this about? Secondly, Netanyahu sort of added to the demands of the war the Trump plan, which is no longer the Trump plan, was called the Gazan Riviera, the idea of voluntary migration
Relocation,
of Palestinians.
Yeah.
This is dead in the water. Everybody in Washington knows that the president hasn't remarked on it for I don't know how many months now. It's not going to happen. As far as Washington sources are concerned, maybe they change their minds. President Trump can be mercurial at times, so maybe he will hear about this again. But Hamas is not going to sign a deal that just says anything about this displacement.
But that's the whole point. Hamas shouldn't be able to sign a deal.
Of Palestinians. So that's also a question. There are real questions whether or not Israel controls the Philadelphia corridor to Egypt, whether or not Israel controls the perimeter around the Gaza Strip so it has more distance between its villages and between whatever is happening in Gaza. There are real questions of how do you build that government in Gaza, because one thing is for sure, and I said this from the beginning of the war on this podcast, Israel will not allow a Hamas rule in Gaza. Now, the question is this a bluff, right? You don't have a Hamas rule, but it controls the government behind the scenes, or is it for real? And another question is it worth fighting for? Is the Delta worth fighting for? Or could we actually control that without controlling the Gaza Strip? So people are saying Arab governments would go in, the UAE would go in, they will have forces on the ground.
Yeah. No.
Everybody knows.
I'm highly skeptical.
Exactly.
No.
Are they going to go house to house and have...
Of course not. Are Emiratis or Saudis or whoever or Egyptians going to want their young men risking their lives to help Palestinians who, let's be honest, they don't really care about?
Exactly. And then,
Yes.
and then the question sort of turns back. And that's a full U-turn and into, so what are we fighting for right now? If we're not going to get that disarmament, and we're not going to get the Gaza relocation, voluntary migration, and there's going to be a government there, but there's no way to know for sure if Hamas is going to be there. What are we going to do? So Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, just before leaving office, made sure that his recommendation is known to Israel's government. And that recommendation was, and that was before the war with Iran was over, before we heard those briefings that Netanyahu wants the war in Gaza to be over. Ronen Bar told them, as long as there will be Palestinians in Gaza, you're going to have Hamas in Gaza.
Exactly.
And because of that, the best case scenario for the Israeli interest, if it is the Israeli interest alone that you have in mind, is to end the war, not with a two-phase deal, Dan,
No.
but with a one-phase deal, because you don't want to leave the hostages, those 10 poor hostages, tortured hostages that will be left after the first phase. You don't want to leave them to Hamas. If you're going to have any ceasefire now, get them all back right now, end the war right now. And what Ronen Bar told the ministers, told the prime minister probably, is if you think about Hamas as an organization, believe me, they will violate the agreement. Why? Because they are Hamas, because they are resistance, they are the Mawakama, the idea of resistance, the idea of fighting against the Israeli oppressor, it's in their DNA. They can't do anything otherwise. And when they will infringe on these agreements, we will need to attack them. It's just a fact of life.
Yes.
And if Israel, this is me adding, if Israel is saying, look, if the Iranians start rebuilding their nuclear program, we're going to attack again, whatever the international community is saying, why can't Israel say the same about the Gaza Strip? If Hamas starts rebuilding, we'll attack again. But anyway, that was the argument made by the former head of the Shin Bet just before leaving office. Get them all back, one deal, end the war, get a different government there, get as many monitoring as you can on that government, and then attack again if Hamas rebuilds. This is your best case scenario. And that was before they started saying, oh,
There
we
are
won the
better
war with Iran.
scenarios.
The truth is, politically speaking, that what happened here, to one extent, for me as an Israeli, is much more difficult to comprehend, to live with. That is, they saw that they won in the war with Iran, and that gives them political leverage. That's the truth, Dan. Because we have won the war in Iran. There were even quotes in the Israeli media saying something like, from coalition sources, we don't want to dilute our victory against Iran with continuing the war in Gaza. So everything is so political in that sense, and that's extremely frustrating. That this is seen through a political lens. But at any rate, if Prime Minister Netanyahu will have this kind of deal and will free all the hostages after the victory with Iran, probably he will go to an early elections. And he stands a good chance of winning that election.
And why? Why does he have a? I mean, if you would have told anyone months ago,
Because if you get an overall deal and you get the hostages back, this is the real victory for the Israeli public. And
and he says I'm going, and now my next term is going to be about Saudi
not
normalization.
even my next term, this term. Look at what the Trump White House is trying to tell us. I don't know if it's going to happen and what's going to go down. But they're saying, Syria is out there. It's possible. Saudi Arabia is possible. Lebanon, maybe Lebanon is. Lebanon is going to pass a decision this week, saying Hezbollah is going to disarm.
Right, and this is all a path to other countries joining the Abraham Accords.
There's something bigger that we discovered during this war. We fought against several enemies. We thought that our biggest enemy is Iran. After Iran, it's Hezbollah. After Hezbollah, it's Hamas. What we really discovered then is that the Palestinian issue and Hamas, that's our biggest enemy. And how do we know that? Because Iran is vanquished. Hezbollah is beaten, and Hamas is left standing, fighting, and killing Israeli soldiers. Iran didn't manage to kill more than one Israeli soldier during the entire war. Hamas killed only 7 Israeli soldiers and an officer last week. And of course, some would say, this is not a good comparison because Iran is...
Yeah, it's a different kind of war.
Yeah, but look,
it's a counterinsurgency versus a war that Israel was fighting in another country, an air war.
True. It's also another way to say we are immersed within the Palestinian conflict. We are there, and because of this is much more of a risk, and this is the point I'm making. All of these ideas of shrinking the conflict, you remember those ideas, right? Shrinking the conflict, the Palestinian issue doesn't matter. No. This is where we didn't manage to bring the type of victory that we brought against Hezbollah. Is also on our border, right? It's not 2,000 kilometers away. It's on our border, and Israel managed to do that much more decisively. And of course, this is because of the local population. We didn't enter Lebanon and occupy large chunks of Lebanon or Iran. It's because of the hostages. We're tying our own hands in some parts of Gaza. It's because of several other reasons. But the bottom line is that here we are, almost 2 years, and we're still fighting with Hamas. We still have hostages in the Gaza Strip, and all the other bigger enemies of Israel, Israel managed to cope with very successfully. And I think that this also goes to the desire in the IDF to reach a conclusion. You want us to occupy this and have a military rule in Gaza? Okay, give us the order. We'll have a military rule. We're responsible for everything. Schools, hospitals, food, whatever. Okay, give us the order. They don't want that in the IDF. But if this is what the government wants, we'll salute, we'll obey. We're the army. That's what we need to do. But if you don't want to do that, that would mean, by the way, that the hostages will die because you need to take over the entire Gaza Strip. If you don't want to do this, okay, so let's think about what's rational and what's realistic, and let's not be completely addicted to fantasies sometimes of the Israeli far-right within the government,
and reinforces the general form.
Sabotaging these ideas of getting to a deal or trying to sabotage them for a really long time. Here's the bottom line. Israelis are still resolute that Hamas can't control the Gaza Strip, but they want the hostages back, and they're starting to understand it's going to be, to an extent, historic viewpoint into the future to make that goal that Hamas isn't a power in the Gaza Strip. And you could see the sign of this with Bennett giving an interview in this weekend. Bennett is running for the prime minister. He's coming from the right wing, and he's saying, let's end the war. And for him to make that statement on Channel 12, to Amit Segal and Ben Caspit, by the way, to make that statement on the record, get the hostages back, and we'll deal with Hamas. This has crossed the Rubicon in the Israeli psyche. That this war is no longer something that is at the best interest. If you can actually end it, get the hostages back and make sure that there is, at least on the record, a different government in the Gaza Strip.
All right, Nadav, we'll leave it there. I'm sure we'll be unpacking more with you in the days ahead on all this. I think the possibility for a deal is, or the path to it is fast moving, or fast accelerating. So look forward to being in touch soon.
Thanks, John.
That's our show for today. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with others who might appreciate it. Time and again, we've found that our listeners are the ones driving the growth of the Call Me Back community, so thank you. And to offer comments, suggestions, sign up for updates, or explore past episodes, please visit our website, arkmedia.org. That's arkmedia.org, where you can deepen your understanding of the topics we cover. Call Me Back is produced and edited by Alon Benatar. Sound and video editing by Martin Huergo and Mary Angelis Burgos. Our Director of Operations is Maya Rakoff. Research by Gabe Silverstein. Our music was composed by Yuval Simo. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Senor.
Welcome to Huberman Lab Essentials.
where we revisit past episodes for the most potent and actionable science-based tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. And now for my discussion with Dr. Anna Lembke. I and many listeners of this podcast are obsessed with dopamine. What is dopamine, and what are maybe some things about dopamine that most people don't know, and probably that I don't know either?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitters are those molecules that bridge the gap between two neurons. So they essentially allow one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. Dopamine is intimately associated with the experience of reward, but also with movement, which I think is really interesting because movement and reward are linked, right? If you think about, early humans, you had to move in order to go seek out the water or the meat or whatever it was. So dopamine is this really powerful, important molecule in the brain that helps us experience pleasure. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, but it's a really, really important one. And if you want to think about something that most people don't know about dopamine, which I think is really interesting, is that we are always releasing dopamine at a kind of tonic baseline rate. And it's really the deviation from that baseline rather than like hits of dopamine in a vacuum that make a difference. So when we experience pleasure, our dopamine release goes above baseline, and likewise, dopamine can go below that tonic baseline, and then we experience a kind of pain.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that one's baseline levels of dopamine, how frequently we are releasing dopamine in the absence of some, drug or food or experience, just sitting, being, is that associated with how happy somebody is, their kind of baseline of happiness or level of depression?
There is evidence that shows that people who are depressed may indeed have lower tonic levels of dopamine. So that's a really reasonable thought, and there's some evidence to suggest that that may be true. The other thing that we know is that if we expose ourselves chronically to substances or behaviors that repeatedly release large amounts of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, that we can change our tonic baseline and actually lower it over time as our brain tries to compensate for all of that dopamine, which is more really than we were designed to experience.
Interesting. And is it the case that our baseline levels of dopamine are set by our genetics, by our heredity?
Well, I think, if you think about sort of, the early stages of development in infancy, certainly that is true. You're kind of, born with probably whatever is your baseline level, but obviously your experiences can have a huge impact on where your dopamine level ultimately settles out.
Do you think that's set in terms of our parents, and obviously nature and nurture interact,
so
but
over here we
is
have
dopamine at the core of our
a
temperament?
cool
I don't really
shift
think we know the answer to that, but I will say that
and
people are
lighter
definitely
value,
born with different temperaments, and those temperaments
and
do
then it
affect
shifts to
their ability to
warmer
experience
and
joy.
darker.
And we've known that for a long time, and we describe that in many different ways. One of the ways that we describe that in the modern era is to use psychiatric nomenclature, like this person has a dysthymic temperament, or this person has chronic major depressive disorder. In terms of looking specifically at who's vulnerable to addiction, that's an interesting sort of mixed bag, because when you look at the research on risk factors for addiction, so what kind of temperament of a person makes them more vulnerable to addiction, you see some interesting findings. First, you see that people who are more impulsive, who have a thought to do something and just do it impulsively, are people who are more vulnerable to addiction. What we now conceptualize in our current ecosystem as mental illness are actually traits that in another ecosystem might be very advantageous. They're just not advantageous right now because of the world that we live in. And I think, impulsivity is potentially one of those, right? Because we live in this world that's such a sensory rich environment, right? That
And
we're
this is the
being
main
bombarded
pelvis
with all
bone,
these
which is the
opportunities, these
point
sensory
that's
opportunities,
supposed to
and
brought
have to
this
constantly
whole
check
shape
ourselves. And
together.
so impulsivity is something that right now can be a difficult trait, but isn't in and of itself a bad thing.
In a previous conversation we had, you said
Okay.
something that really rung in my mind, which is that many people who become addicted to things
And now
have this
surrounding
feeling that
area
normal
is
life isn't interesting enough.
warmer
Maybe you could
again,
just tell us a little bit about your experience
getting
with
away
this
from us,
association, if it really exists,
because
between,
that's the main
people's
bone
sense
popping
of that
up.
normalcy, or maybe even how boring life can be, and their tendency to become addicts of some sort.
I think that life for humans has always been hard, but I think that now it's harder in unprecedented ways. And I think that the way that life is really hard now is that
And
it
getting
actually
darker
is
as-
really boring.
As goes
All
away.
of our survival needs are met. We don't even have to leave our homes to meet every single physical need, as long as you're of a certain level of financial well-being, which frankly, we talk so much about, the income gap, and certainly there is this enormous gap between rich and poor, but that gap is smaller than it's ever been in like the history of humans. We don't really have anything that we have to do. So we're all forced to make stuff up, whether it's being a scientist or being a doctor or being an Olympic athlete,
Have a visual
or,
problem to
climbing
solve.
Mount Everest. And people really vary in their need for friction, and some people need a lot more
Okay,
than
at
others. And
this
if they
point,
don't have
this
it,
form
they're
is
really,
getting
really
away
unhappy. And I do think that a
completely,
lot
so the
of
form is
people that I
just
see with
getting
addiction and
away
other
and
forms of mental
shifting
illness
towards
are people
cool
who
and
need more
dark.
friction. Like they're unhappy, not necessarily because there's something wrong with their brain, but because their brain is not suited to this world.
Let's talk about the pleasure-pain balance and addiction. And I've heard you use this seesaw or balance scale
Right.
analogy before, and I think it's a wonderful one.
Okay.
Yeah, so to me, one of the most significant findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located, which means the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And they work like a balance. So when we feel pleasure, our balance tips one way. When we feel pain, it tips in the opposite direction. And one of the overriding rules governing this balance is that it wants to stay level. So it doesn't want to remain tipped very long to pleasure or to pain. And with any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what scientists call homeostasis. And the way the brain does that is with any stimulus to one side, there will be a tip in equal and opposite amount to the other
Okay,
side.
we have
Like the
this negative
principal laws of
space
physics.
here.
Yes, right. So like, I like to watch YouTube videos. When I watch YouTube videos of American Idol, it tips to the side of pleasure. And then when I stop watching it, I have a come down, right, which is a tip to the equal and opposite amount on the other side. And that's that moment of wanting to watch one more YouTube video, right? It's not something that consciously happens or that we're aware of unless we really begin to pay attention. And of course, one way to combat that is to do it more, right? And more and more and more. So I think that is really what I want people to tune into and get an awareness around, because once you tune into it, you can see it a lot. And if you keep the model of the balance in mind, I think it gives people kind of a way to imagine what they're experiencing on a neurobiological level and understand it, and in that understanding get some mastery over it, which is really what this is all about. Because ultimately, we do need to disengage, right? We can't live in that space all the time, right? We have other things we need to do, and there are also serious consequences that come with trying to repeat and continue that experience or that feeling.
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, when we find something that we enjoy that feels pleasurable, social media, food,
Right.
sex, gambling, whatever
So
happens,
just like
there's some
these
dopamine
two
release when
darks
we engage
going
in that.
together,
And then what
these
you're telling me is that
lights
very quickly,
of the
Yes.
tie over there
beneath
and the
my
tie
conscious
over here
awareness, there's a
emerge
tilted
together.
back of this scale
This
where
is one light
pleasure is
shape,
reduced by way of increasing pain.
and this is one dark shape.
And I've heard you say before that the pain mechanism has some competitive advantages over the pleasure mechanism, such that it doesn't just bring the scale back to level, it actually brings pain higher than pleasure.
What happens right after I do something that is really pleasurable and releases a lot of dopamine is, again, my brain is going to immediately compensate by down-regulating my own dopamine receptors, my own dopamine transmission, to compensate for that, okay? And that's that come down or the hangover or that after effect, that moment of wanting to do it more. Now, if I just wait for that feeling to pass, then my dopamine will re-regulate itself and I'll go back to whatever my chronic baseline is. But if I don't wait, and here's really the key, if I keep indulging again and again and again, ultimately I have so much on the pain side, right, that I've essentially reset my brain to what we call like an anhedonic or lacking in joy type of state, which is a dopamine deficit state. So that's really the way in which pain can become the main driver, is because I've indulged so much in these high reward behaviors or substances that my brain has had to compensate by way down regulating my own dopamine, such that even when I'm not doing that drug, I'm in a dopamine deficit state, which is akin to a clinical depression. I have anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and a lot of mental preoccupation with using again or getting the drug. So in general, what we want is some kind of flexibility in that balance and the ability to easily reassert homeostasis. We don't want to break our balance, which is possible if we overindulge for enough period of time and end up with a balance tipped to the side of pain, this dopamine deficit state we've been talking about. We want a flexible, resilient balance, right? Which can be sensitive to things going on in the environment, which can experience pleasure and approach, which can experience pain and recoil, right? This is all adaptive and healthy and necessary and good. We would never want a balance that doesn't tilt.
Right.
That would be a disaster.
Right.
We wouldn't be human. And we wouldn't want that. It would be really, really boring. On the other hand, what people in recovery from addiction talk about is, to some extent, having to learn to live with things being a little boring a lot of the time, right? So trying to avoid some of this intensity and thrill seeking and escapism that really is at the core of addictive tendencies.
So along those lines, I've heard you say that in order to reset the dopamine system, essentially in order to break an addictive pattern, 30 days of zero interaction with that substance, that person, etc.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and 30 days is, in my clinical experience, the average amount of time it takes for the brain to reset reward pathways, for dopamine transmission to regenerate itself. By depriving ourselves of this high dopamine, high reward substance or behavior, we allow our brains to regenerate its own dopamine for the balance to really flow, and then we're in a place where we can sort of enjoy other things.
So I'd like to dissect out that 30 days a little more finely. So days 1 through 10, I would imagine will be very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Anxiety, trouble sleeping,
Yep.
Physical agitation, and
Yes.
to the point where, maybe impulsive, angry. Should one expect all of that? Should the
Yeah, so what I say to patients, and it's a really important piece of this intervention, is that you will feel worse before you feel better.
For how long?
Yeah.
This is probably the
So-
first question
right,
they
yes.
ask, right?
And I say usually in my clinical experience, you'll feel worse for 2 weeks. But if you can make it through those first 2 weeks, the sun will start to come out in week 3. And by week 4, most people are feeling a whole lot better than they were before they stopped using their substance. So it's a hard thing. Like, you have to sign up for it.
Then days 21 through 30, dopamine is starting to be released in response to the taste of a really good cup of coffee, for
Yes,
instance.
exactly.
Whereas before it was only to insert, addictive behavior.
Right.
One thing I've seen over and over again, sadly, often in the same individuals, is they get sober from whatever, they're doing great, and then all of a sudden you get this call. So-and-so's back in jail, so-and-so's wife is going to leave him because he drank 2 bottles of wine and took a Xanax at 7 a.m., crashed his truck into a pole, he's got 2 beautiful kids. Like, how did this happen again? to the point where by the fourth and fifth time, people are just done. And so what I'd like to talk about in this context is what sorts of things help other people that we know that are addicted? What really helps? And are there certain people for whom it's hopeless?
Yeah, so there are people who will die of their disease of addiction. And I think conceptualizing it as a disease is a helpful frame. There are other frames that we could use, but I do think given the brain physiologic changes that occur with sustained heavy drug use and what we know happens to the brain, it is really reasonable to think of it as a brain disease. And for me, the real window of, let's say, being able to access my compassion around people who are repeat relapsers, even when their life is so much better, when they're in recovery, it's like a no-brainer, right? Is to conceptualize this balance and the dopamine deficit state and a balance tilted to the side of pain, and to imagine that for some people, after a month or 6 months or maybe even 6 years, their balance is still tipped to the side of pain. That on some level, that balance has lost its resilience and its ability to restore homeostasis.
It's almost like the hinge on that balance is messed up.
Exactly.
Yes.
Imagine that you had an itch somewhere on your body, okay? I mean, we've all had that, like, whatever the source. If you really focused, you could go for a pretty good amount of time not scratching it. But the moment you stopped focusing on not scratching it, you would scratch it. And maybe you do it while you were asleep, right? And that is what happens to people with severe addiction.
Good
That
example.
balance is essentially broken. Homeostasis does not get restored despite sustained abstinence. They're living with that constant specter of that pull. It never goes away. So let me say there are lots of people with addiction for whom that does go away, and it goes away at 4 weeks for many of them. But in severe cases, that's always there, and it's lingering, and it's the moment when they're not focusing on not using, it's like a reflex. They fall back into it. It's not purposeful. It's not because they want to get high. It's not because they value using drugs more than they do their family. None of that. It's that really they cannot not do it when given the opportunity and that moment when they're not thinking about it. Does that make sense?
That's a great description, and actually in that description I can feel a bit of empathy, because the way you describe scratching an itch in your sleep,
Yeah.
I've done that with mosquito bites in summer,
Right.
you're scratching, you wake
Right.
up scratching that
Right.
mosquito bite. And I also have to admit that I've experienced not feeling like I want to pick up my phone because it's so rewarding, but just finding myself doing it.
Yes, of course.
Like, I'm not
yes.
going to use this thing, I'm not going to use this thing,
Right.
and then just finding myself doing
Yes.
it. Like, what am I
right.
doing here?
Right.
Sort of how did I get back here
Yes.
again?
Right.
And I know enough about brain function to understand that we have circuits that generate deliberate behavior, and we have circuits that generate reflexive behavior. And one of the goals of the nervous system is to make the deliberate stuff reflexive, so you don't have to make the decision, because decision making is a very costly thing to do.
Exactly.
Decision making of any kind.
Right.
Why is it then that people will relapse, not just after getting fired from a job or their spouse leaving them, but when things are going really well?
Yes.
Is it this unconscious mechanism? Because I've seen this before.
Well,
They
that
have a
does
great
make
way. I
sense,
have a
because
friend
if
who's
things go well,
really impressive
you need to
creative.
less
I don't
you
wanna
need
reel any
less
more than that,
attention
but,
to get by.
and
Therefore,
relapsed upon
scratching
getting
in the
another
sleep.
really terrific opportunity to create for the entire world. And I was like, how can that happen? But now I'm beginning to wonder, was it the dopamine associated with that win that opened the spigot on this dopamine system? Because it happened in a phase of a really great stretch of life.
Yeah. Triggers are things that make us want to go back to using our drug. And the key thing about triggers, whatever they are, is they also release a little bit of dopamine, right? So just thinking about whatever the trigger is that we associate with drug use, or just thinking about drug use, can already release this anticipatory dopamine, this little mini spike. But here's the part that I think is really fascinating. That mini spike is followed by a mini deficit state. So it goes up, and then it doesn't go back down to baseline, it goes below baseline tonic levels. and that's craving, right? So that anticipation is immediately followed by wanting the drug, and it's that dopamine deficit state that drives the motivation to go and get the drug. So many people talk about dopamine. It's not really about pleasure, but about wanting and about motivation. And so it is that deficit state that then drives the locomotion to get it.
And earlier, your description of dopamine being involved in the desire for more, giving the sense of reward, but also movement.
Right.
I have to assume that those things are braided together in our nervous system
Yes.
for the specific intention of when you feel something
Yes.
good, then you feel the pain, but
Yes.
maybe you don't notice it, and then the next thing you know, you're pursuing more of the
Yes,
thing that
and I
could
love the way you
overflow.
use the word braided together.
I
That's beautiful.
like that
there
too.
are people for whom bad life experiences, loss, in any form, stress in many different forms, that's a trigger. But there are absolutely people for whom the trigger is things going well.
Okay, so
and the things going well
let
can
me
be like the
explain
reward of
this
things going well, but
over
very
here.
often what it is the removal.
This is a highly saturated blue, right? But in the model, what it is that in terms of value, it does not differ from thing over here. So what is tricky, and I have to pay attention to, is to not be misled by the high saturated value and think of it as a lighter value, because I have to get the value right, and the value is equal to the value over here, but this one is a desaturated color, this one is a highly saturated blue, but same value.
Of the hypervigilant state that's required to keep their use in check. So it's this sense of, I want to celebrate, or I want to, this reward happened, I want to put more reward on there. And it's really, really fascinating, because when people come to that realization about themselves, that they're most vulnerable when things are going well, that's really a valuable insight, because then they can put some, things in place, or barriers in place, or go to more meetings, or whatever it is that they do, to protect themselves.
I wanted to just touch on something that you mentioned, which is the shame.
Yeah.
I heard you say in an interview with somebody else recently that truth-telling and secrets are sort of at the core of recovery. And tell us more about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found really fascinating about working with people in recovery was how telling the truth, even about the merest detail of their lives, was central to their recovery. It's not even just not lying about using drugs. I have to not lie about anything. I can't lie about why I was late to work this morning, which we all do. Oh, I hit traffic. No, I didn't hit traffic. I wanted to spend 2 more minutes reading the paper and drinking my coffee, right? So people with addiction will get into a lying habit where they're lying about random stuff because they're sort of in the habit of lying. And how recovery is really about telling the truth. And there's really interesting neuroscience behind it that suggests that when we tell the truth, we actually potentially strengthen our prefrontal cortical circuits and their connections to our limbic brain and our reward brain. And of course, these are the circuits that get disconnected when we're in our addiction, right? Our balance in our reward pathway, our limbic brain, our emotion brain is doing one thing, and our cortical circuits are completely disengaged from that, ignoring what's happening, which is easy to do because it's reflexive. We don't need to think about that balance for the balance to be happening. But we have to re-engage those circuits, anticipate future consequences, think through the drink, not just how am I going to feel now if I use, but how am I going to feel tomorrow or 6 months from now. And that telling the truth is in fact a way to do that, to make these connections stronger. And I talk about some studies in my book that kind of indirectly show that. So I find that really fascinating. Plus, just that like being open and honest with people really does create very intimate connections. And those intimate connections create dopamine. You think people are going to run away from you if you tell them about all like your weird neuroses, but really they don't. What they're like is, oh, thank God, I'm not the only one, right?
I love that there's neuroscience being done on truth-telling
Yeah.
and the value
Yes.
of truth-telling.
Yeah.
I hope they'll continue to do more work.
Yeah.
Want to ask you about using drugs to treat drug addiction. This is a vast area, right? Different chemistries for different drugs and different purposes, but that the rationale, as I understand it, is take people who are in a pattern of addiction, launch them into a experience that's also chemical and extreme, often of the extreme serotonin and or extreme dopamine type. So MDMA,
Right.
ecstasy, for instance,
Mhm.
tons of serotonin dump,
Mhm.
tons of dopamine dump. How neurotoxic, if neurotoxic, debatable, et cetera, not the topic for now, but a lot. And then somehow that extreme experience wrapped inside of a supported network in there, whether or not there's just someone there or whether or not they're actively working through something with the patient, is supposed to eject the person into a life where drug use isn't as much of interest. This violates everything we've talked about in terms of dopamine biology. It would, if this arrangement is the way I described it, cause more addiction. It is anything but a dopamine fast. It's a dopamine feast. So we hear about successful transitions through this, at least anecdotally, and maybe someone will say, "What is going on? What is going on? Doesn't make any sense to me."
Yeah. So I think it's good that you're skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all should be skeptical. Having said that, there are clinical studies showing, and these are small studies and they're short duration, small number of subjects, but taking people, for example, who are addicted to alcohol and then having them have this, let's say, psychedelic experience in a very controlled setting.
So either
Yes.
typically it's a high dose psilocybin or 3-dose, as
I
I
quit
saw it in the
smoking
MAP study
on
of
LSD.
MDMA, of
Right.
ecstasy. Those are sort of seem to be
Yes,
the kind
it's
of
a typical,
of bread and butter of this
Right.
kind of work.
Right.
Yeah.
But the thing to really keep in mind is that this is completely interwoven with regular psychotherapy, and that these are highly selected individuals.
And
right?
clinical trials.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
we're
And these are
referring to legal clinical
right,
trials.
right. When it works, it's a transformational experience because it gives the person another lens through which to view their lives, which I think for some people is positive and powerful because they can come back from that and be like, oh my gosh, I care about my family and I want X, Y, or Z for them, and I realize that my continuing to drink is not going to, achieve that. So it's almost like a spiritual or values based. So I think it can be very powerful. But having said that, I truly am quite skeptical because addiction is a chronic relapsing and remitting problem. It's hard for me to imagine that there's something that works very quickly short term that's going to work for a disease that's really long lasting.
Yeah, the two addicts I know that did MDMA assisted psychotherapy as part of this thing both got worse.
Yeah.
Really?
But the people I know who had severe trauma, who took this approach, seem to be doing
Well,
better. And so
maybe the point
I
is
think that
not
the
all
discussion as we
addictions
hear it
come
now is just sort of
from the same
psychedelics,
source.
which is a huge category.
So that
right,
might
and includes
depend
many
on the
different
source.
drugs and compounds with different effects. And we hear about trauma and addiction lumped together. And I think it's going to be important for people to know that this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, but it sounds like it may have some utility under certain conditions.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm trying to be very open-minded about its potential utility for certain individuals, but I can tell you in my clinical work what is a very concerning unintended consequence of this narrative is I have a lot of people who are looking for some kind of spiritual awakening who on their own, not in the context of any kind of therapeutic psychological work, microdose or want to try, psilocybin or MDMA with a friend or wherever so they can have this, spiritual experience that they can figure out their lives. That's a disaster and almost never works out well. And I can just tell you that the downstream effect for the average person is that they've misconstrued the data on the use of psychedelics for mental health conditions to this idea that they're safe or that anybody can take them in any circumstance and have this kind of awakening. And that's not what the data show, right? The data are these highly controlled settings.
There are a couple other things I just want to touch on, but they all relate to social media.
Okay.
I have to imagine that we need to regulate, not necessarily eliminate this behavior. How addicting is it, and what is healthy social media behavior?
The first message I would want to get across about social media
Okay.
is that it really is a drug, and it's engineered to be a drug, which doesn't mean that we can't use it, but we need to be very thoughtful about the way we use it. And so that means with intention and in advance planning our use, right? And trying to use it as a really awesome tool to potentially connect with other people and not to be used by it or get lost in it. We do need to figure out, how to make this tool something that's going to be good for us and not ultimately harmful. As more and more of us are spending more and more time on social media, we're divesting our libidinous energies, etc., from real life interactions. So I think our collective challenge, and it should be our mission, is to make sure that we are preserving and maintaining offline ways to connect with each other. So this is the key. You have to, with intention, prior to being in that situation, think of literal physical and metacognitive barriers that you can put between yourself and your phone or whatever your drug is, to create these intentional spaces where you're not constantly interrupting yourself essentially and distracting yourself, because I really do think we're losing the ability to have a sustained thought, right? I mean, we get so far, and then you get to that point in the thought where it's a little bit hard to know what's coming next, and it's very easy to check your phone or check your email or look something up on the internet, and then you never get that opportunity to finish that thought, which is really the source of creative energy and an original thought, right? You're not just reacting to
Right, and
what's
something
coming
that
at
can
you.
contribute to the world. I know a number of people are going to have questions and want to get in contact with you. You are not on social media.
That's correct. Yes.
You are true to
Yes.
your ideology. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing this information, and I know I learned a ton, and I know everyone else is going to learn a lot more about addiction and the good side of dopamine.
That's right. Thank you for having me. It's been really, really great to talk with you.
Okay. Okay, in the original picture, he's on a beach, and this is the towel that he has, and it is blue, but I'm not sure if I put it there it would be compositionally the best shape. Yeah, I think it would be misleading for reading the shape, because we already have the shadow of the feet over here, and it adds complexity of shapes in this area. And if I have a shape that resembles this here, it won't help. Okay, that's good to know.